I followed my mother in the same post, and my father before that, so it does cover a good many years.
At 4:42 a.m., a call bypassed every usual palace channel, and the name requested was not the king, but Catherine. On the line, the Duke of Kent was said to be making a final, urgent confession about who should inherit his most prized crown jewels. What followed would not just challenge Camilla, but raise a question of legacy the monarchy has never truly resolved. The confession. The Duke of Kent turned 88 in October. Those who had seen him in recent months described a man whose body had weakened, but whose mind remained precise, alert, and deeply disciplined. His dry wit was still intact. So was the sense of duty that had defined more than 6 decades of royal service. He was never known as a man who spoke carelessly, and certainly not one who invited drama. He had spent much of his life observing, absorbing, and saying very little. That is exactly why his decision to speak now carried such force. When a man like the Duke of Kent chose to break his silence, it suggested that silence itself had become impossible to bear. At the center of the dispute was not a set of jewels the public would instantly recognize. These were not the famous crowns and diamonds housed in the Tower of London. They were, in many ways, more powerful than that. This was a private collection, built over generations within the Kent line, shaped not by state ceremony, but by intimate royal history. Among the pieces were a sapphire and diamond parure, a matching necklace, earrings, and brooch believed to date back to the 1840s, and long associated with Queen Victoria. There were Indian origin pieces acquired during the colonial era, a diamond tiara worn by Princess Marina of Greece at major state occasions, and several smaller heirlooms whose value lay as much in their provenance as in their price. For years, the future of these jewels had remained a private matter. The Duke had never addressed it publicly. There had been occasional mentions of inheritance through his son, the Earl of St. Andrews, but those with long memories understood the collection differently. To them, it belonged to a much older tradition, one tied not simply to title, but to a particular line of royal womanhood and continuity. Then, the atmosphere changed. What shifted, according to those close to the Duke, was the growing interest from Camilla's office after her position as Queen Consort became firmly established. At first, the approach was subtle. Questions were raised about the collection's history. A representative attended a private exhibition viewing and returned with interest that seemed to go well beyond routine documentation. Then, in September, a formal letter arrived. It expressed admiration for the jewels and suggested that their future home should reflect their importance to the broader royal family. The Duke of Kent recognized what was happening immediately. He had seen enough palace maneuvering to understand when admiration was being used as the language of claim. He did not answer publicly. He did not issue a warning. He simply went quiet, considered everything carefully, and then made the phone call that would change the entire conversation. The call that changed everything. Those who spoke with the Duke of Kent in the weeks before the call to Catherine described a man working through a decision of considerable weight. He asked questions of his own advisors about the legal mechanisms governing private royal collections. He requested historical documentation on the provenance of several key pieces. And he made at least 2 calls to senior members of the College of Arms, the heraldic authority that maintains genealogical and ceremonial records for the royal family, asking specific questions about inheritance precedent. What he was doing, those who understood his methods recognized, was building a case. Not a legal case, exactly, but something the Duke of Kent valued even more, an institutional case, rooted in history, precedent, and the kind of quiet authority that cannot be overturned by memoranda or political maneuvering. By the time he called Catherine, he had already made his decision. The call was not deliberation, it was declaration. According to sources who have since been briefed on the conversation, the Duke opened by telling Catherine directly that he had watched her work for over a decade, with the admiration of someone who understood what genuine royal service looked like and how rarely it was performed without calculation. He told her he had known her since she was a young woman, navigating an institution that was not always kind to those who entered it from outside, and that he had seen her transform from an outsider into someone who understood the monarchy's purpose more clearly than many who had been born into it. Then he told her about Camilla's letter. He read portions of it to her, his tone dry and precise, and then said something that Catherine reportedly found difficult to respond to in the moment. He said that in his experience, when someone wanted something badly enough to write a letter like that, they generally got it eventually, through patience, attrition, or the simple advantage of outlasting any opposition. Unless, he added, the opposition had been clearly and formally established, while there was still time to establish it. He then told her his intention. He would be documenting, through his solicitors, a formal expression of his wishes regarding the collection's future. Princess Marina's tiara, the sapphire parure, and 3 other specified pieces would be designated with a letter of intent, indicating they were to be considered appropriate for Catherine, Princess of Wales, in recognition of her service to the institution and her position as the future Queen of England. The remaining pieces would pass through normal succession channels. But those 5 items, the ones with the deepest connection to the Kent family's history of royal women who had served with distinction, he wanted associated with a woman who met that description in the present generation. Catherine, by all accounts, was silent for a long moment. Then she told him she was deeply moved and did not know what to say. The Duke reportedly replied that saying nothing was entirely appropriate and that the situation did not require her to perform gratitude. It required only that she be aware of his wishes and that she understand why he had chosen to state them clearly rather than leave them ambiguous. He said one more thing before the call ended. He told her that ambiguity, in his experience, was the enemy of justice, and that people who understood the machinery of institutions had a habit of exploiting ambiguity in ways that those who trusted the institution never anticipated. He had trusted enough in his long life. He was done trusting. Why the Kent jewels matter. To understand the full significance of the Duke of Kent's declaration, it is necessary to understand what these pieces represent beyond their monetary or aesthetic value. They are, in the most precise sense, artifacts of a particular kind of royal womanhood, one defined not by birth, rank, or marriage title, but by demonstrated commitment to the institution across decades of service. Princess Marina of Greece, who married Prince George, Duke of Kent in 1934, was considered by many historians of the period to be one of the most naturally regal figures of the 20th century royal family. Educated, multilingual, possessed of genuine cultural sophistication, she had brought something to the British monarchy that it often struggled to articulate, but recognized instinctively when it saw it. A quality of authentic distinction that made the institution appear more significant simply by her association with it. She wore many of the pieces now in question at moments of genuine historic weight. The diamond tiara appeared at state occasions spanning 3 decades. The sapphire parure was photographed at the 1953 coronation. These items carry her history in their physical form. The Duke of Kent had watched his mother navigate an institution that was not always kind to those who came to it from elsewhere. He had seen her work to earn the respect that others received simply by accident of birth. And he had spent the decades since her death in 1968 maintaining a private relationship with those pieces that went beyond mere ownership into something closer to stewardship. When Camilla's office had come asking, what they had asked for, in the Duke's understanding, was not simply jewelry. They had asked to absorb into Camilla's identity the accumulated symbolic capital of Princess Marina's legacy. They had asked to position Camilla as the inheritor of a tradition she had not participated in building. The Duke of Kent found this, in the bluntest possible terms, unacceptable. His admiration for Catherine was not incidental. It was specifically calibrated. He had watched her approach her role with a seriousness that reminded him, those close to him said, of women he had known who understood instinctively that royal service was not a performance, but a vocation. He had watched her build genuine expertise in areas she could have merely gestured at. He had seen her bear the weight of public scrutiny during her illness, with a dignity that he recognized as authentically earned rather than staged. These were, in his assessment, the qualities that Princess Marina's pieces deserved to be associated with, and the decision about that association was still his to make. Camilla's office discovers the truth. The first indication that something had shifted reached Clarence House not through official channels, but through the informal network of palace intelligence that has always operated alongside formal communication. A solicitor's letter, seen by someone who should not have seen it, mentioned in summary language the Duke of Kent's intentions regarding several items of the private collection. The summary did not include names, but the context was unmistakable. Camilla's chief aide received the information on a Tuesday afternoon and spent the following hour confirming through two separate sources that the summary was accurate. By early evening, a carefully worded inquiry had been dispatched to the Duke of Kent's private secretary, a space that feels unfamiliar, a space where access is no longer automatic, where involvement is no longer expected, framed as a follow-up to the September letter regarding historical documentation of the collection. The Duke's private secretary responded the following morning with a reply that was brief to the point of curtness. The Duke had attended to the matter of the collection's future. All relevant documentation was in the hands of his solicitors. There was nothing further to discuss. At Clarence House, the silence that followed this response was described by those who witnessed it as pressurized. Camilla had understood, from the moment she had heard of the collection months earlier, that these were not pieces she could simply request. She had understood that the approach needed to be careful, sustained, and framed in the language of heritage preservation rather than personal acquisition. She had believed she was being careful. She had believed the September letter struck precisely the right note. She had been wrong, and the Duke of Kent, with a thoroughness that spoke to decades of watching palace maneuvering from a careful distance, had not simply declined her implicit request. He had preemptively and formally redirected everything she had been working toward. The pieces she had imagined adding to her ceremonial identity would instead become associated with Catherine. Camilla did not express her reaction publicly. To those closest to her, she said very little. But palace staff who saw her in the days following described a woman who appeared to be processing something significant with great internal effort. Her public engagements continued with practiced professionalism. Her private communication reduced to essentials. And one senior advisor noted, with careful understatement, that the atmosphere in her offices during that period was not light. William is briefed. Catherine told William the same evening she received the call. She did not frame it as a victory. She did not discuss it in terms of what it meant for Camilla. She told him what the Duke had said, read him several passages she had written down immediately after the call, and then asked him what he thought should be done. William's response, according to those familiar with the conversation, was measured in a way that suggested he understood immediately the full institutional weight of what had happened. He asked several precise questions. Had the Duke's solicitors received formal written instruction? Had any other senior royals been informed? Was the Duke in a condition to have the documentation legally witnessed in proper form? The answers, as Catherine understood them, were yes, no, and the Duke's solicitors were managing the process according to his explicit instructions. The legal framework was already being established. What remained unclear was how the palace as an institution would receive the information when it became more widely known. William made 2 calls that evening. The first was to a senior constitutional advisor with whom he had worked closely on questions of royal legal precedent. He described the situation in general terms, without naming the Duke specifically, and asked about the legal standing of private letters of intent regarding personal royal collections. The advisor confirmed what William had suspected. Such letters, while not legally binding in the way formal wills were, carried significant institutional weight and had historically been respected as expressions of genuine royal intent, a careful, deliberate movement away from the center of the monarchy's operations, one that preserves dignity, avoids confrontation. The second call was to Princess Anne. Anne's response, as those familiar with her manner would expect, stripped the situation to its essential structure within approximately 90 seconds. An elderly senior royal has expressed a clear preference about the future of his private collection. That preference has been documented. Clarence House had been making inquiries about the collection. Those inquiries have now been preempted. What exactly, she asked, is the complication? William said the complication was managing the aftermath in a way that did not create lasting institutional damage. Anne was quiet for a moment, then said something that William apparently found both useful and characteristically direct. She said the real question was not how to manage the aftermath, but whether the aftermath required managing at all. The Duke of Kent had made a private decision about private property. Camilla's office had overreached. The situation had resolved itself. The only way it would become complicated, Anne suggested, was if someone tried to reopen it. No one tried to reopen it. The king is told. Charles received word of the situation 3 days after Catherine's call with the Duke of Kent, informed by his private secretary in a morning briefing that covered several matters of household importance. The summary was factual and concise. The Duke of Kent had expressed formal intentions regarding his private collection. The documentation was with his solicitors. The specifics would eventually become matters of record. Charles sat with this information for what those present described as a longer silence than usual. He asked one question: had Camilla been made aware? His private secretary confirmed that Camilla's office appeared already to know, through channels that were not entirely clear. Charles did not call William. He did not call the Duke of Kent. He did not issue any instruction to his private secretary about how the palace should respond. Instead, he asked to continue with the remainder of the briefing, and for the rest of the morning conducted his scheduled appointments with the focused attention that those who worked with him recognized as his method of managing information that he could not immediately resolve. His private position, as those close to him understood it, was one of profound conflict. He respected the Duke of Kent's autonomy. He understood, at the level of constitutional instinct, why such decisions were made and why they carried authority. But he also understood what the implicit message of the Duke's choice communicated about Camilla, that among those who had watched the monarchy most closely for longest, there were those who did not accept Camilla's claim to the symbolic inheritance of royal womanhood. That rejection, however privately expressed, carried a weight that Charles felt acutely. He spoke to Camilla that evening, not about the specifics. Those were not things he could address directly without acknowledging the full scope of what had happened, but about, as those aware of the conversation described it, the importance of focusing on the work that was genuinely hers rather than on what she might have imagined adding to it. It was advice delivered with care. It landed, by all accounts, with considerable difficulty. The institutional reckoning. When senior palace advisors began discussing the implications of the Duke of Kent's declaration in the weeks that followed, what emerged was not simply analysis of one elderly man's private wishes. It was a reckoning with a pattern that several had been watching develop for some time. The Duke of Kent had not acted in isolation. He had acted as the visible point of a sentiment that ran deeper through the institution than Camilla's office had understood or acknowledged. Among those royals who had lived through the monarchy's most turbulent period, who had watched the institution absorb the cost of Charles and Diana's marriage and its dissolution, who had then watched Camilla's slow rehabilitation from figure of public hostility to queen consort, there remained a persistent and carefully unarticulated reserve. It was not hostility. It was not a refusal to accept the formal facts of Camilla's position. It was something more subtle and more durable. A conviction, held privately by several senior figures, that the symbols and artifacts of royal womanhood, accumulated through generations of genuine institutional service, were not simply available to be absorbed by whoever occupied a title, that they belonged, in some essential way, to a lineage of demonstrated commitment that could not be shortcut by marriage or elevation. The Duke of Kent, who had been part of the royal family for longer than most of its current members had been alive, had expressed that conviction in the most concrete way available to him. He had directed the objects he was responsible for toward the woman he believed represented that lineage in the present generation. Constitutional analysts who were briefed on the situation noted the significant restraint of the decision. The Duke had not made public statements. He had not given interviews. He had not attempted to influence public opinion or generate media pressure. He had done what powerful people within institutions have always done when they wanted to register a view that the formal structure would not easily accommodate. He had worked within the rules, used the mechanisms available to him, and created a fact on the ground that was difficult to argue with and impossible to simply override. The formal legal status of his letter of intent remained, as his solicitors acknowledged, advisory rather than binding. The collection would formally pass according to standard inheritance procedure, but the expressed wishes of a prince of blood regarding items of historic significance carried a weight in royal culture that those outside the institution sometimes underestimated. They would be known, they would be documented, and they would be very difficult to act against without appearing to override the deathbed wishes of a man who had served the monarchy faithfully for over 60 years. Camilla's advisors understood this, which was why, after the initial shock of discovery, the response from Clarence House was not protest or counter-argument, it was silence. The kind of silence that indicated a decision had been made to absorb the loss, minimize the visibility of the episode, and move forward without drawing further attention to what had occurred. What the Duke's words revealed. Beyond the immediate question of inheritance, the Duke of Kent's declaration opened a window into a conversation that had been taking place privately within the royal family for considerably longer than the public was aware. Those who had spoken with the Duke in his final years described a man who thought deeply about what the monarchy was for and what it required of those who served it. He had no patience for the performative aspects of royal life, the ribbon cuttings and the grip and grin photography that consumed so much of the institution's public energy. What interested him was the deeper question of whether the people carrying the institution forward understood what they were carrying. He had watched Catherine with that question in mind. He had seen her engage with her charitable work at a level of seriousness that he recognized as genuine expertise rather than surface engagement. How one is remembered. What makes this moment particularly significant is not just the shift itself, but the direction it signals. He had observed how she navigated the specific cruelties of public life during her illness with a composure that he did not attribute to media management, but to genuine character. And he had watched her, in the years following her recovery, return to her work with an intensity that suggested she understood the time she had been given as a resource not to be squandered. These were not small observations. They were the assessments of a man who had watched members of the royal family for 9 decades and had developed considerable precision in distinguishing those who served the institution from those who used it. His view of Camilla was not simply unfavorable, it was specific. He had watched her work to secure a place in the public's acceptance, had acknowledged that work is real and in some respects admirable, but he had also watched the pattern of behavior that had accompanied her rise. The gradual expansion of her operational ambitions, the careful acquisition of influence dressed in the language of coordination, the tendency to mistake the symbols of institutional authority for the substance of it. He recognized this pattern because he had seen it before, in other figures, across his long observation of the institution. And he had learned that unchecked, it tended to produce exactly the kind of episode that had culminated in William's public reversal. His letter of intent was, in one reading, simply a private legal expression of preference. In another reading, it was the considered judgment of someone who had watched longer than almost anyone else and had reached a conclusion he felt obligated to express before he no longer could. Catherine and the weight of what she carries. Catherine received formal confirmation from the Duke's solicitors 3 weeks after the phone call. The letter was brief, precise, and addressed to her directly. It referenced the Duke's intentions without elaborating on his reasoning, and requested her acknowledgement of receipt. She signed and returned the acknowledgement the same day. Those who spoke with her in the weeks following described someone who carried the situation with deliberate quietness. She did not discuss it with staff beyond those who needed to be aware. She did not reference it in her public engagements. She continued the charitable work that the Duke had pointed to when explaining his decision, visiting facilities, attending policy discussions, maintaining the decade-long relationships with organizations that had defined her public identity. But those close to her noted a particular quality in her manner during that period. A thoughtfulness, one friend described it, that went beyond her usual careful composure. An awareness, perhaps, of what it meant to have been seen, truly seen, by someone whose capacity for seeing was both rare and nearly at its end. The Duke of Kent had told her, in the most concrete way available to him, that her work had been witnessed and found worthy, that the symbols of a tradition she had entered from outside were, in the judgment of someone qualified to make that judgment, rightfully hers. That inheritance in the monarchy's deepest sense was not simply a matter of title or marriage, but of demonstrated belonging earned through years of unglamorous, serious, genuine commitment to something larger than oneself. For Catherine, who had spent years managing the tension between the public narrative of her life and its private reality, this was not a small thing. It was, in a quiet way, a kind of recognition that no press statement or opinion poll could replicate. She sent the Duke a handwritten note the day she received the solicitor's letter. Those aware of its contents described it as brief and personal, expressing gratitude in terms that acknowledged what he had done without inflating it. The Duke reportedly had it read to him twice. The longer reckoning. As weeks became months, and the immediate episode settled into the longer memory of palace insiders, what remained was not simply the story of jewels or letters, or phone calls made in the small hours of the morning. What remained was a question about the nature of royal legitimacy and how it was actually conferred. The formal mechanisms were clear enough. Title, marriage, appointment, succession, these were the legal and ceremonial structures that determined who held what position. But the monarchy had always operated on something beyond the formal, a kind of interior legitimacy conferred not by ceremony, but by the accumulated judgment of those who knew the institution from inside its actual functioning. The approval of those who had watched longest, the recognition of those whose own lives of service gave their assessments weight. The Duke of Kent had exercised that interior legitimacy in the most direct way available to him. He had looked at the two women whose claims on a certain kind of royal inheritance were in question, and he had made a judgment. His judgment was not binding. It was not absolute. But it was, for those who understood how the monarchy actually worked beneath its formal surface, significant in ways that no official pronouncement could quite replicate. Camilla would continue. She would perform her duties with the professionalism she had developed over years of careful rehabilitation. She would appear at state occasions, represent the crown at official functions, and gradually reassert the public identity that William's reversal and the Duke of Kent's declaration had temporarily disrupted. The institution would accommodate her, as it always accommodated those whose formal position required accommodation. But the quiet judgment of a man who had watched since before most current royals were born would remain part of the record. The sapphire parure, Princess Marina's tiara, the pieces that carried the weight of a particular tradition of royal womanhood, these, in the Duke's clear and documented assessment, did not belong to Camilla's story. They belonged to Catherine's. And in an institution where the long memory matters more than the immediate headline, that judgment would endure long after the news cycle had moved on. The question of what true royal inheritance means, whether it can be conferred by marriage alone or must be demonstrated through years of authentic service, touches something deeper than palace politics. It speaks to how any institution preserves the values it claims to represent. Where are you watching from today, and what do you think? Can legitimacy be inherited, or must it always be earned?